Oak Haven, the American West, a summer morning, the sun already merciless before noon. The sheriff's leather whip uncoiled slowly, and the shackled man on the platform stood perfectly straight, head up, eyes forward, refusing to look down. Then a woman pushed through the hostile crowd and didn't stop. She held out every dollar. She had $70, her last cent, and locked eyes with the sheriff without flinching. "Don't hurt him." Her voice didn't waver. "I'll take him." This is the story of two strangers, a stolen valley, and a love forged from the ashes. Stay with us. You won't want to miss a single chapter. The sun had no mercy that morning. It pressed down on Oak Haven like a hot iron on wet cloth, turning the dirt roads to powder and the air to something thick and stale. Flies were everywhere, buzzing around the horses tied to hitching posts, circling the slop buckets outside the saloon, landing on the backs of necks, and not being swatted away because nobody had the energy. 100 degrees before noon, and climbing. Eleanor Vance stood at the edge of the crowd in the town square, her canvas hat pulled low, her dark eyes scanning the scene unfolding near the old feed store. She had come to Oak Haven for flour and salt pork. She had not come for this. But here it was, anyway. A wooden platform had been thrown together near the gallows post, rough-hewn planks over old barrels, the kind of construction that was never meant to last. It didn't need to. It only needed to hold one man, and that man was shackled from wrist to wrist. The iron was heavy. Eleanor could tell by the way his arms hung not limp, not defeated, but pulled down by sheer weight. His wrists were raw underneath the cuffs, the skin there an angry, dark red. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, and dressed in the torn remains of a leather jacket that had once been something fine, fringed along the sleeves, beaded across the chest. And on the left shoulder, half hidden beneath a smear of dried blood, was something Eleanor nearly missed. A military insignia, an Army Scout's mark, stitched into the leather with deliberate, careful work. She went still. The man on the platform was Lakota. That was plain enough. His dark hair was matted and dust-covered, and there was a gash above his right brow that had bled freely and dried in the heat. He stood straight anyway, head up, eyes forward. The crowd around him was loud and ugly, men pressing close, saying the kinds of things men say when they've decided someone isn't quite a person. He didn't look at any of them. Sheriff McKenna stood to the left of the platform, one thumb hooked in his belt, the other hand resting on the coiled leather whip at his hip. He was a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and the slow, satisfied bearing of someone who enjoyed having an audience. "This here is your chance. Good people of Oak Haven," he announced, projecting over the crowd. "Caught red-handed on Prescott land. 3 cattle dead, and the evidence clear as the nose on your face. Harrison Prescott is a generous man rather than see this one hang. He's offering the County Labor Authority the opportunity to put this animal to work. The Ridgemont mines are always looking for strong backs." Someone in the crowd laughed. Someone else whistled. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She knew the Ridgemont mines. Everybody in the county did. Men went in and didn't come out. Or if they did, they came out broken in ways that didn't fully show on the surface. Calling it labor was being generous. Calling it justice was something else entirely. "Starting bid at $50, McKenna called out. "Who wants to save themselves the cost of hiring seasonal help?" The bidding started. A few men called out half-hearted numbers, more for sport than serious interest. Eleanor wasn't listening to the numbers. She was looking at the man on the platform. He hadn't moved, not once. He stood in the full blast of the sun, without squinting, without shifting his weight. Whatever they had done to him before dragging him out here, and from the look of him, it had been considerable. It hadn't taken anything essential from him. There was something in his posture, the particular steadiness of it, that told her he had decided the only thing left in his control was his own stillness. So he was being still. Ethan had told her about a Lakota scout once. Over supper, years ago, back when supper was something that happened in peace. He'd been riding with a small cavalry unit through a flooded valley, and a flash storm had come up faster than anyone expected. The scout had guided them through terrain that should have been impassable, calm the entire time, reading the land like it was written in a language only he could see. Ethan had said, "That man saved 7 lives and didn't ask for so much as a thank you." Eleanor looked at the insignia again. Then she looked at the gash above the man's brow, the ruined wrists, the iron that was meant to break a person's dignity before it broke their body. She reached into the front pocket of her work coat and counted the folded bills she carried there. $70. Every cent she had managed to pull together this month, earmarked for ranch supplies and backfeed costs. Without it, Stone Creek would fall another 2 weeks behind. She was already stretched, razor thin. McKenna raised his whip. Not at the prisoner, not yet. But the gesture was clear enough a reminder of what he had in his hand, a slow uncoiling meant to draw the eye. The man on the platform looked at the whip. That was the first time he moved, a single shift of his gaze downward, and then back up. And in that moment, Eleanor saw something cross his face. Not fear, something worse. Recognition, the look of a person who had survived this particular category of cruelty before and knew exactly what came next. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Eleanor was already moving. She pushed through, not rough, but deliberate, her shoulder turning sideways, where the bodies were packed tight, stepping past a man in a canvas duster, past a woman who gave her a sharp look, past 2 boys who had climbed onto a fence post for a better view. She came out at the front of the crowd and walked to the platform without stopping. Miss McKenna looked down at her with mild amusement. "This is county business. Best to stand back." She ignored him. She reached into her coat pocket and held up the folded bills, spreading them open with her thumb so the amount was visible. $70, she said. Her voice was steady. She had worked at keeping her voice steady through things that were harder than this. "I'll pay it." The sheriff's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You're bidding?" "I'm ending the bid." She held his gaze. $70 and you're walking away ahead of what you came in with. The mines can find their own labor. There was a ripple through the crowd. A few men objected, calling out that the bid wasn't finished, that she had no standing here, that she was a widow woman, and what did she think she was doing? She heard all of it the way you hear rain against a window present but not entering. McKenna looked at the money. Then he looked at the prisoner. Then he looked back at Eleanor with the expression of a man calculating whether the path of least resistance was worth the dignity it cost him. He took the money. He took it without ceremony, folding it into his vest pocket, and turned to wave at his deputy to unlock the shackles. The man on the platform, Maka, though Eleanor didn't know his name, yet finally looked directly at her. His expression was unreadable, not grateful, not suspicious, not anything she had a word for. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something that doesn't fit into any category he's prepared for. The shackles came off. He stepped down from the platform without assistance, landing in the dust of the square with the kind of controlled care that told her the chest wound she hadn't noticed yet was worse than his face was letting on. The crowd parted around them, not warmly, but enough. Eleanor turned to face the platform once more, and she spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. She wasn't making a speech. She wasn't performing. She was just saying what was plainly true. "Don't hurt him," she said. "I'll take him." The square went quiet for a moment, the way places do when something has happened that can't be immediately categorized. Then the flies went back to buzzing, and the heat pressed back down, and Eleanor Vance walked out of Oak Haven's town square with a stranger in a ruined leather jacket, 2 steps behind her, and $70 less to her name, and something that felt, if she was honest, very much like her late husband's voice telling her she had done exactly right. The ride back to Stone Creek took the better part of an hour. Eleanor kept her eyes on the road ahead, and Amaka sat behind her on the horse, without complaint, without conversation, without anything at all. She could feel the tension in him, the rigid control of a man keeping himself upright through sheer will. Once, on a downhill stretch where the trail curved and the horse adjusted its footing, he gripped the back of the saddle to steady himself, and she heard the sharp, quiet intake of breath that he immediately swallowed. The chest wound. She'd have to look at that tonight. The ranch came into view as the sun began its long afternoon slide, the split-rail fence, the water trough, the leaning hay barn that always looked like it was thinking about falling. but never did. The main house was modest, one story, stone and timber, with a covered porch running the full front length. Ethan had built most of it himself. Eleanor had finished the kitchen corner after he was gone. She dismounted, looped the reins over the post, and turned to find Maka already on the ground. He hadn't waited for help or offered to take it. He was standing at the edge of the yard, scanning the perimeter, the fence line, the tree cover to the north, the open stretch between the barn and the house, with the methodical attention of someone who had spent years keeping himself alive in unfamiliar terrain. "This way," she said. She pushed open the front door and led him through the small sitting room and into the kitchen, where the afternoon light came through the south window and made the space feel more generous than it was. She pulled out a chair at the table. He didn't sit. She crossed to the dry sink, poured water into the basin, and set a clean cloth beside it. Then she went to the shelf above the stove, where she kept her medical supplies, a small bottle of carbolic solution, linen strips for bandaging, a needle and thread for the worst cases. She set them on the table without comment. "The cut above your eye needs cleaning," she said. "And I think you've got a rib situation that's worse than you're showing. I'd like to take a look when you're ready." He said nothing. She had expected that. The man hadn't made a sound since Oakhaven, not on the ride, not walking through the door. She didn't push it. There were plenty of reasons a person might stop talking, and most of them were valid. She turned her back to him and started the water heating on the stove. She could hear him behind her, his breathing, the soft shift of his boots on the floorboards, the faint creak when he moved closer to the center of the room. Then the air changed. It was the only way she could describe it later. The air simply changed, and she turned around. He had the skinning knife. From the table she'd left it out that morning after cutting rope for the south fence repair, hadn't thought anything of it, and it was at her throat. Not quite touching, close enough that she could feel the temperature of the steel. His eyes were fixed on her, dark and absolutely steady. The hand holding the knife was steady, too. But what she saw in his face wasn't rage. It was something harder to sit with than rage. It was the focused, cold alertness of a man who had learned that every gesture of help eventually revealed its true price, and he was simply waiting to find out what hers was. She did not move. She didn't step back, didn't raise her hands, didn't make a sound. She held his gaze with the same quality of stillness he had shown on that platform in the square, because it was the only language she had at the moment that might reach him. A second passed, then another. She spoke carefully, and she kept her voice level. "If I meant you harm," she said, "I had 70 easier ways to do it before we left that town." His expression didn't shift. "I'm not asking for gratitude," she continued. "I'm not asking for anything. You can walk out that door right now, and I won't stop you. But if you're staying, I need you to put the knife down." She watched him. He watched her. The blade lowered. Not quickly, not with any theatrical flourish. It just came down, slow and deliberate, and he set it back on the table with the same care he'd picked it up with. Then he pulled out the chair and sat down in it. And if that wasn't the closest thing to a white flag she'd ever seen, she didn't know what was. Eleanor exhaled once, quietly, and went back to the stove. She carried the warmed water to the table in a tin bowl and set it beside the carbolic and the cloth. She took the chair across from him and looked at the gash above his brow. It had stopped bleeding sometime during the ride, which was good, but it had dried badly and there was dust packed into the edges of it. "This is going to sting," she said. She dipped the cloth in the carbolic solution and pressed it to the cut. He didn't flinch. She cleaned the wound in careful passes, working from the center out, and when she was done, she blotted it dry and laid a linen strip across it. "I'm Eleanor Vance," she said, while her hands were still working. "This is Stone Creek Ranch. My husband, Ethan, built it. He's been gone 3 years. She tied off the bandage. "I saw the insignia on your jacket," she said. "Army Scout. Lakota, I think." Ethan rode with a cavalry unit once that had a Lakota scout. He talked about that man his whole life. The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked as the fire settled. "I'm not saying you're the same man," she added. "I'm saying that's why I recognized what you were, and it's why I knew you didn't kill Prescott's cattle." She sat back and looked at him directly. Prescott doesn't own those cattle to start with. Half the water in this valley runs through his land because he dammed it up 3 years ago, and nobody had the money or the spine to fight him in court. Ethan was going to. He didn't get the chance. She said that last part, without drama. It was just a fact, and she had learned to carry it as one. Maka was still watching her. She could see him processing not the words exactly, but her, the way she sat, what she did with her hands, whether her eyes matched what her mouth was saying. She had the sense of being read very carefully by someone who had become extremely good at reading people, because his life had depended on it for a long time. The chest, she said, and nodded toward his jacket. Will you let me look? A pause. Then he reached up and pulled the jacket off his left shoulder, moving it aside just enough for her to see the right side of his ribcage. There was bruising, deep and mottled, spread across 3 ribs at least. When she pressed 2 fingers gently to the lowest one, the muscle under her hand contracted sharply. Cracked, she said. Maybe 2 of them. Not broken through, I don't think. Or you'd be in considerably worse shape than this. She sat back. I can wrap it, but it needs to stay wrapped for several weeks. And you can't be hauling fence posts or throwing saddles until it starts to knit. Understood? He looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, barely above the sound of the stove, he said a single word. Maka. She looked up. He said it again. His name, offered like something being handed over carefully. Something that mattered, given to her as a measure of trust that she understood, was not extended easily or often. Maka, she repeated, and made sure she said it the same way he did. Something in his face shifted, not quite a softening, more like a recalibration. She had gotten it right, and that registered. All right, Maka. She stood and went for the bandaging linen. Let's get you wrapped up. Then I'll find you something to eat, and you can sleep in the barn tonight where it's clean. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next. He didn't argue. He didn't thank her. He sat straight in the chair while she worked, and said nothing more, and in that silence there was something that hadn't been there when he'd walked through the door with a knife in his hand. Something that was beginning, slowly and without fanfare, to resemble trust. Outside, the late sun stretched long shadows across the yard of Stone Creek Ranch, and the creek itself ran low and quiet over the flat stones below the south ridge, and the evening came on easy, the way it sometimes did in that country, when the heat had finally spent itself, and the world agreed, for a little while, to be still. Eleanor sat on the porch steps long after Maka had gone to the barn. She held a tin cup of coffee she wasn't drinking and looked out at the dark pasture and thought about Ethan. Not in the painful, circular way she'd thought about him in the first year after his death, going over the same scenes again and again, like picking at something that wouldn't heal. More the way you think about someone when they feel close, when the day has carried an echo of them. He would have liked this, she thought. He would have liked Maka. Then she thought about the knife at her throat and what had been in those dark, watchful eyes, and she revised that thought slightly. He would have understood him, she corrected. That's closer to right. She went inside and slept. He was already working when she came out in the morning. Eleanor stepped onto the porch with her coffee and stood there a moment, watching. Maka had found the tools in the lean-to beside the barn. She hadn't shown him where they were, but he'd found them anyway, and he was working the east fence line, resetting a post that had been leaning at a 20-degree angle since spring. He had the post bar and a tamping rod, and he worked in a steady, economical rhythm, driving dirt around the base of the post, checking the angle, adjusting, driving again. She noted that he was favoring his right side, keeping the heavy work on his left arm and shoulder, honoring the wrapped ribs without making a production of it. He'd been at it for a while, long enough that there was sweat darkening the back of his shirt. She brought a second cup of coffee out and left it on the top fence rail at a distance that wasn't crowding him, and went back to her own work. She had the chickens to feed, water to carry from the storage barrel to the vegetable patch, and a harness that needed its buckle replaced before she could use it on the roan. They worked like that through the morning, parallel, separate, occasionally, passing within a few yards of each other on their way between tasks, and exchanging nothing except the occasional nod that acknowledged the other person without demanding anything from them. It suited both of them. By mid-morning, Hetty showed up. She came through the kitchen door with her boots already muddy and her dark braids half undone, carrying a jar of preserves that Dr. Jeremiah had sent over and chattering about a bird's nest she'd found in the elm tree at the edge of the doctor's property. She was 7 years old, small for her age, and she had not yet learned that the world expected her to move through it quietly. Eleanor hoped she wouldn't learn that for a long time. Eleanor, there are 4 eggs and they're blue. Did you know birds made blue eggs? I didn't know that. She stopped on the porch steps. Her eyes had found Maka at the fence. Eleanor watched Hetty take him in. The leather jacket, now folded over the rail. The dark hair tied back with a piece of leather cord. The careful, practiced way he moved. Who's he? Hetty asked. His name is Maka, Eleanor said. He's going to be helping on the ranch for a while. Hetty considered this. She had the focused, evaluating stare of a child who had seen enough uncertainty in her short life to assess new people with some care. Is he nice? She asked. I think so. We're still getting acquainted. That was enough for Hetty, apparently, because she set the preserves on the porch rail and went down the steps and walked across the yard toward the fence at the completely uncomplicated pace of someone who had not yet been taught to be afraid. Eleanor watched and didn't stop her. Maka noticed the girl way coming from some distance off. He noticed everything from some distance off, and he stopped work and waited. When Hetty reached the fence and grabbed the top rail and peered over it at him, he looked down at her with an expression that was not warm exactly, but wasn't closed either. I'm Hetty, she said. He said his name. She tried it, got it slightly wrong, tried it again, and got it right, and seemed pleased with herself. Then she pointed at the fence post he'd been working. It was leaning like that all summer, she said. Eleanor said she was going to fix it, but she kept not fixing it. From the porch, Eleanor decided she didn't need to hear any more of that particular conversation, and went inside to start the noon meal. Through the window above the dry sink, she could see Maka return to the tamping rod, and Hetty climb up to sit on the top rail and watch him, narrating the bird nest situation in considerable detail to someone who gave no verbal response whatsoever, but also showed no sign of wanting her to stop. Eleanor allowed herself a small, private smile, and then went back to her onions. The afternoon brought harder work. There were 3 horses in the south pasture that had been fence testing all week, and Eleanor had been putting off the inevitable. She needed them moved to the upper paddock, and getting them there meant working the gate correctly while managing the lead, which was always a 2-person job when one of the horses was the gray gelding, who had opinions about everything. She found Maka at the water trough, washing the morning's dust off his forearms. She explained the situation without ceremony. He listened, and when she finished, he simply moved toward the pasture gate. She followed. What happened in the next 40 minutes was one of the more instructive things Eleanor had watched in a long time. He didn't use force, didn't rush the horses, didn't shout, didn't make the sharp movements that put animals on edge. He used positioning, mostly, putting himself in certain places in the pasture, standing a particular way, and the horses, even the gray with the opinions, moved around him and eventually through the gate. With the resigned cooperation of animals who needed the path of least resistance was wherever this person wasn't standing. She had been working horses for 15 years, and she learned something new. When the gate was latched behind the last one, she said so. Where did you learn that? She asked. He looked at the horses moving away into the upper paddock. Then he said, in his measured, careful English that she was beginning to recognize as deliberate rather than halting, horses tell you where they want to go. You find that place. Then you are where they would be, and they must go somewhere else. You move last. She thought about that. Prescott's men use whips, she said. Prescott's men get kicked, he said. She let out a short, genuine laugh, and it surprised her. It had been long enough since something surprised a laugh out of her that she noticed it. They walked back toward the house through the late afternoon heat, and for the first time, the silence between them was entirely comfortable. Nothing needed to be said. They had done a job together, and it had gone well, and that was a complete thing. It was the first of several. Over the following days, Maka moved through the ranch with a growing ease that Eleanor found herself looking forward to. Not just because she needed the help, though she did, badly, but because she had forgotten what it was to work alongside someone who had the same investment in the outcome that she did. Hired hands drifted. They did their hours and left. Maka worked like the land was something he cared about, which was a quality Eleanor understood. He was also teaching her things quietly, without making instruction feel like instruction. Small things about tracking water movement through soil, about reading which direction an animal had moved through grass by the way the blades bent. Once, in the upper canyon, he showed her how to find groundwater by watching where the insects gathered in the early morning. She told him about Stone Creek, about Ethan, about the water rights that Prescott had been quietly annexing for years before anyone understood what was happening. He listened like he was filing it away carefully, in a place where things didn't get lost. 3 weeks into this arrangement, on a morning when the air already smelled like an oven by 7 o'clock, Eleanor went down to the creek to check the water level and found the channel nearly dry. She stared at it. The rocks that were usually submerged were exposed. The flow that came down from the upper ridge had dropped to a thin, troubled trickle, and the mud along the bank was dark and strange-looking, with an oily discoloration around the edges that she'd never seen before. She called for Maka without thinking. He came down the bank and crouched at the water's edge and looked for a long time. He put 2 fingers in the mud, brought them to his nose, and his expression went flat and certain. "Blocked upstream," he said, "and something has been added to the mud. Plant-based, I think. Bitter root, possibly. It will not kill cattle quickly, but over time it weakens them, makes them thin, makes the land look like it is failing on its own." "Prescott," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked up at her. "This is deliberate work," he said. "Someone who knows this land well enough to find where to dam it and what to put in the mud to make the damage look natural." He stood. "We need to go upstream and clear it." Today, they went. The blockage was 2 miles up the ridge, which surprised her. It meant someone had gone to considerable effort in the middle of the night, or the early morning hours, to get that far onto Stone Creek land without being noticed. The dam itself was crude but effective. Rocks and packed brush and a layer of clay that had been pressed into the gaps to hold it tight. It had probably been built in stages over several nights. Working in the full blast of the noon sun, they dismantled it. It was brutal work. The rocks were heavy, and the brush had been packed so tightly that pulling it loose required leverage and time. Eleanor's arms ached in a way that would leave marks for days. She didn't say so. Maka's wrapped ribs slowed him on the heaviest lifts, and he worked around it, finding the angles, and she matched her work to his. At one point, she was knee-deep in the creek bed, hauling at a particularly stubborn wedge of clay-packed brush, and she slipped on the algid rock below the waterline and went down hard on one knee. She caught herself with her hands, came up muddy to the elbows and laughing, and when she looked up, Maka was right there, one hand extended. She took it. He pulled her to her feet with an ease that surprised her, and they were standing very close together for a moment, water rushing around their boots as the creek began to run again, a thin rush at first, and then gathering, and then running freely. His hand was still around hers. She looked up at him. He looked at her. Then the current pushed against her legs, and she shifted her weight, and the moment moved on the way moments do, but something had registered between them, acknowledged without words, set carefully aside for later. The creek ran clear. They worked for another hour treating the mud along the bank. Maka knew which plants would counteract the contamination, and he moved along the water's edge with the confidence of someone who had been taught by people who understood the land in the way that required generations to learn. Eleanor followed and listened, and when he explained what he was doing and why, she held it alongside everything else she was quietly coming to understand about the man working beside her. By mid-afternoon, they were headed back down the ridge toward the ranch, carrying the tools and moving slowly because both of them were tired in the bone-deep way that honest work produces. Hetty was sitting on the porch when they got back. She had been drawing in the dirt with a stick, making shapes she intended to be horses. When she looked up at Maka coming through the gate, she set down her stick and said, without particular weight, the word she had heard a boy in town use the day before. Eleanor stopped walking. She crouched down in front of Hetty so they were on the same level, and she kept her voice even and clear because this was not a moment for anger. Anger would make it about the word. She wanted it to be about the truth. That word is not one we use, she said. And I want to tell you why, because you deserve to understand it, not just be told no. Hetty looked at her with wide, serious eyes. When people use that word, they are trying to say that a person is worth less than them because of where they come from. But a person's worth is measured by the integrity of their actions and the kindness in their heart, never by the color of their skin or the tribe they belong to. She held Hetty's gaze. Maka has done more honest work in 3 weeks on this land than most men do in a year. He pulled me out of a creek today. He knows things about this earth that nobody else here bothered to learn. She paused. The boy, in town, who used that word, what do you know about him? Hetty thought about it. He broke Mrs. Hadley's fence and didn't say he did it. Yes, Eleanor said. He did. So which one of those two people is worth more, Hetty? The one who does honest work and tells the truth, or the one who breaks things and lies about it? Hetty didn't need to think long. Maka, she said. That's right. Eleanor stood up. Now go apologize to him and mean it. Hetty slid off the step. She walked over to where Mahaka stood at the fence, and she looked up at him with the full gravity of 7 years old, facing an error. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't know that word was like that. I won't say it again. Maka looked down at her for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he said, I know. He reached down and picked up her drawing stick from the dirt and handed it back to her. She took it, looked at the stick, looked at him, and then went back to her dirt horses with the resolved efficiency of a child who had decided the matter was settled. Eleanor leaned against the fence post and looked out at the creek, running clear now, catching the last of the afternoon light on its surface, and she thought that some things, when you unclog them, when you do the hard work of removing what should never have been blocking them in the first place, simply ran the way they were always supposed to. The nights at Stone Creek had always been quiet. That was one of the things Eleanor loved about the ranch, the particular silence that settled in after dark, broken only by the creek running over stones and the occasional complaint of a horse shifting in the barn. Ethan had loved it too. They used to sit on the porch after supper and just listen to it, not needing to say much of anything. Those nights felt like a different life now. She was 3 weeks into sleeping lighter than she used to, waking at small sounds, lying in the dark and listening until she was sure of what she'd heard. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like the body keeping its own accounts, adding up the sabotaged creek and the poisoned mud and the way Sheriff McKenna had looked at her in the town square and deciding to stay alert regardless of what the mind wanted. Maka slept in the barn. He'd made that clear from the first night, not the house, and she hadn't pushed it. The barn was dry, and the hay was clean, and he'd rigged a second door latch on the inside that hadn't been there before, which told her everything she needed to know about what kind of sleep he was capable of in an unsecured place. It was past midnight when the horses told her something was wrong. She heard Calla, first the gray mare, who was the most sensitive of the three, the one who picked up changes in the air before the others did. One sharp whinny, cut short, then silence, then the bay gelding, a low agitated sound, and the shuffle of hooves against the paddock boards. Eleanor was already sitting up. She pulled on her boots and her coat in the dark, not lighting the lamp, and took the rifle from the wall mount beside the door. She stood at the window for a count of 20, watching the yard. The moon was up and nearly full, and the open ground between the house and the barn was pale and clear. She saw the first rider at the tree line, then the second, then 4 more, spreading out in a loose arc at the edge of the light, moving with the practiced, unhurried confidence of men who had done this before and expected no serious resistance. Black mask riders, 6 of them, maybe more she couldn't see, hung back in the trees. She moved to the back of the house and cracked the rear window. She went back to the front, watching. The riders had stopped at the edge of the yard, and for a moment nothing happened, and the stillness of that was somehow worse than if they'd come straight in. Then, two of them split off toward the south pasture. She understood immediately. The stallion, Cairo, her led stallion, was in the south pasture. He was the best animal on the ranch, the one Prescott's men had tried twice to buy, and she'd twice refused to sell. She pulled open the front door. One of the remaining riders called out, muffled by the dark cloth across his face, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "You had your chance to sell, widow. Prescott's patience is done." She raised the rifle and her voice at the same time. "Get off my land." The rider laughed. It was an unpleasant sound. From the south pasture, a shot rang out. She heard Cairo scream that high, terrible sound a horse makes that nothing else sounds like. And then the sound stopped, and the silence after it was worse. Her grip on the rifle tightened until she felt her knuckles against the wood. The barn door came open. Maka came out of it in total silence. No lamp, no silhouette against light, already moving low and fast along the shadow of the barn wall before she'd fully registered that he was there. He had the long knife from his belt and something else she couldn't make out from this distance. He went for the brush line south of the barn at a dead run, staying in shadow the entire way, and then he was simply gone from her sight into the dark. Two of the riders near the barn wheeled their horses, trying to track him. They couldn't. He wasn't where they were looking. She heard a grunt, a thud, the startled exclamation of a man who finds himself on the ground without having made the decision to be there. Then another, from a different direction. One of the riders near the house shouted something to the others, pulling his horse sideways, trying to locate the threat. He couldn't. His horse was picking it up. The animal sidestepped and tossed its head in that way horses do when something is near and wrong and invisible. The next 15 minutes unfolded like this: chaos on their side, controlled and purposeful movement on Maka's, the two things never quite meeting. He moved through the dark like he'd been born in it, disarming men without killing them, using the terrain and the darkness the way Eleanor had seen him, used the pasture with the horses not force, but positioning, controlling the space until the thing he wanted to happen was the only thing with room to happen. By the time the riders pulled back to the tree line, two of them were on foot, their horses loose and moving away toward the lower meadow. A third was sitting in the dirt of the yard, his head in his hands. Eleanor came off the porch with the rifle still up. "You tell Prescott," she said, and she said it loud enough to carry to the tree line, "that this land is mine. The water is mine. And the next men he sends are going to be explaining themselves to federal marshals." She didn't know yet if she could make that last part true, but she said it like she could. The riders went. She stood in the yard until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she lowered the rifle and looked around. The barn was intact. The house was intact. But to the south, a warm orange light had begun to pulse against the dark, and by the time she turned around it had already climbed, and the hay barn, the smaller outbuilding east of the main barn, full of the winter hay she'd spent 3 weeks cutting and stacking, was on fire. She moved toward it, and Maka appeared out of the dark beside her and stopped her with one hand on her arm. "Too far," he said quietly. "We can't save it." She knew he was right. The structure was old and dry, and the fire had been set at multiple points. Along the base, she could see the separate columns of flame, and there was nothing to be done. She stood and watched it burn. The man sitting in the dirt of the yard had not moved. When the fire got bright enough to see clearly by, she looked over at him and saw that he was maybe 25, younger than she'd expected, his mask pulled down now, and his face looking pale and somewhat stunned by the chain of events that had resulted in him being on the ground with no horse and no backup. She walked over and stood above him. "You work for Prescott," she said. He looked at the burning barn and then at her and didn't deny it. "You're going to walk back to town," she said. "And when you get there, you're going to think very carefully about whether Harrison Prescott is worth what this job is going to cost you." She looked at him steadily, because men who do this work for men like him don't retire comfortably. They just become inconvenient. "You understand what I'm telling you?" He got up. He left without a word. Maka had been doing something in the dirt near the area where the riders had gathered, and she went to him when the young rider was gone. He was crouched over the ground, sorting through something. When she reached him, he stood up and held out his hand. In his palm was a badge, silver, federal style, but small and irregularly stamped, the kind of thing made to look official that hadn't come from any federal office. On the back, scratched into the metal, was a mark she recognized. She'd seen it before, on the paperwork that passed through the sheriff's office when she'd gone to file the water rights complaint 18 months ago. McKenna's mark. This fell from one of them, Maka said. Eleanor turned the badge over in her fingers. It was the link she'd known had to exist between the Black Mask Riders and the sheriff's office, but knowing it and holding the evidence of it were two different things. He's working with Prescott, she said, directly, not just looking the other way, working with him. Maka looked at her. In the firelight, his expression was careful and precise. This valley is not the only place where men like Prescott have worked, he said. They find the one in authority who wants what they want. They give him a share. Then the law becomes the tool instead of the check. She had understood that abstractly for a while now. Holding the badge made it concrete. We need to keep this safe, she said. He nodded. He had already been thinking that, the hay barn burned down to its frame by morning. Eleanor sat on the porch steps and watched it go, the rifle across her knees, and Maka sat beside her, not crowding, not touching, but close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the night air. They watched the fire until it became embers, and neither of them slept. In the quiet before dawn, when the fire was mostly just a dull red glow, and the horses had finally settled, Maka said something unexpected. Your husband, he said. You said he was going to fight Prescott. He was, Eleanor said. He'd found out about the water theft. He was putting together documentation to take to federal marshals in Cheyenne. She paused. He died before he could go. They said it was fever. She felt Maka go still beside her. It was not fever, he said. It was not a question. She looked at him. There was something in the flatness of those words, the certainty, that went beyond sympathy. No, she said. I've known for a while that it wasn't, but knowing and proving are different things. He was quiet for a moment. The embers shifted in the ruined barn frame. I have been looking for Prescott for a long time, he said at last. Before Oakhaven, before the auction block. He turned and looked at her directly. We are hunting the same man, Eleanor. She held his gaze. She had suspected something like this. The Army Scout insignia on a man who showed up in a county where Prescott happened to run things wasn't coincidence, and she had learned early in her marriage to Ethan that coincidence was usually just a pattern you hadn't traced back far enough yet. Then maybe it's time we started doing it together, she said. He looked at the dawn coming up over the east ridge, pale and thin at first, spreading. Yes, he said. Behind them, the remains of the hay barn smoldered in the early light, and Prescott's badge sat wrapped in cloth in Eleanor's coat pocket. And somewhere in the ashes there was enough anger between the two of them to last a very long time. The weeks after the raid reshaped Stone Creek. It was subtle at first, the way things are when a situation quietly crosses a line, and the people living inside it don't mark the exact moment it happened. But Eleanor could feel it. The ranch ran differently now, more deliberately. Maka had begun sleeping closer to the house, not in it, but in the lean-to adjoining the main barn, where he could hear the yard and see the south approach. He'd rigged 2 new warning lines across the north path, thin cords strung between posts at ankle height, with tin cans threaded on them, crude but effective. She hadn't asked him to do any of this. He had simply decided it needed doing. Eleanor, for her part, had started keeping the rifle inside the house instead of on the wall mount, closer to the door, ready. She'd written 2 letters to the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne, detailing what she could document about the water rights seizure and the sheriff's badge she'd found. She hadn't yet sent them. She wanted more before she sent them. She and Maka worked through those weeks with a shared urgency that didn't need to be spoken aloud. They both understood that the raid had been a warning and that the next move would not be a warning. Prescott had been patient, in his way, using legal pressure and economic strangulation. First the water theft, the poisoned mud, the bid at the auction to remove Maka from the equation. He'd tried the slow method. Now he knew it wasn't working. That made him dangerous in a different way, but it also made him likely to make mistakes. Maka had begun to talk more. Not a great deal. He wasn't built for a great deal of talk. And she was coming to understand that this wasn't reticence so much as economy. He said what was accurate and what was necessary, and he didn't pad it. But in the evenings when the work was done and they sat on the porch or at the kitchen table, he talked about things she had never known and would never have known from anyone else. He told her about tracking, about reading terrain, about how weather moved through mountain passes and how to use that movement to plan rather than react. He told her about the land in the Northern Territories, the creek systems, and the animal migrations. And he spoke about these things with the fluency of someone for whom geography was not a map but a lived experience. She told him about the ranch, about Ethan, about the first year after Ethan's death when she'd nearly lost Stone Creek 3 times, once to a crop failure, once to a debt that came due without warning, and once to her own exhaustion, the kind that goes past the body and into something deeper. "How did you keep it?" he asked once, when she'd described that third time. She thought about it. "I woke up one morning and I was furious," she said. "I don't know what I was more furious at Ethan for dying, or Prescott for what he was doing to the water, or myself for almost giving up. But I got up and I went to work." She looked at her hands. "You can do a lot of things while you're furious." Maka looked at her with something that was close to recognition. "Yes," he said, "you can." In the second week of November, on a morning that had turned cold overnight and left frost on the fence posts, Maka found something while he was working the north section of the fence line. He came back to the house directly, which he didn't usually do mid-morning. He came through the kitchen door with mud on his boots, and his expression, closed down in that particular way that she had learned, meant he was processing something significant. She set down the mending and looked at him. He put a piece of paper on the table. It was old, the edges had been weathered and then dried out until they'd gone stiff and pale, and had been folded so many times that the creases had started to break. He had it open, and she could see it was a hand-drawn map of the valley with water sources marked and land parcel lines sketched in. At the bottom were 2 sets of initials she recognized: E.V., Ethan Vance, and beside them, in a different hand, H.P. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "Under the stone cap on the northeast fence post, 3rd from the corner." He sat down across from her. "Someone hid it there, deliberately. I think a long time ago." She studied the map. The water sources Ethan had marked didn't match the current flow of things they showed where the creek fed should have gone. The natural routes before the dams, the aquifer points that Prescott had systematically blocked or claimed. At the top, in Ethan's careful hand, was a single line of notation. Testimony: diversion witnesses identified Cheyenne FM contacted NOV. 1882. She sat back. November 1882 was 2 months before Ethan died. "He was further along than I knew," she said. It came out quiet. "He had names," Maka said. "Witnesses." She looked at the initials again. "H.P. Prescott. Sign this." Ethan had him sign something documenting the original water rights before Prescott started the diversions. He had proof. Prescott would have known Ethan had this, Maka said, or suspected it, which means the fever story was never true, Maka said. "We already knew that. But this is why. He was too close." She pressed her palm flat on the map and was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was very still. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing against the north wall of the house in low, steady gusts. Then she lifted her head. "Tell me about your village," she said. Maka looked at her. Then he looked at the table. "I have been waiting to say this since the auction block," he said. He told her slowly. In the measured way, he told everything, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that the things he was about to say were true and therefore deserved precision. His village had been in the northern valley, 2 days' ride from the current county line. They had not been at war. They had been farming and hunting and doing the ordinary work of living in a place where their people had lived for generations. Prescott had wanted the land, not for cattle, for the mineral rights underneath it, silver. in quantities that a man with capital and connections could transform into something enormous. He had sent men first to negotiate, which meant to threaten. When that didn't move people who had nowhere else to go, and no reason to trust promises from men who had never kept them, he'd sent different men. He had sent men with guns and fire. Maka had been away scouting for the army unit he'd contracted with 3 days east, and when he came back, there was nothing to come back to. He had spent the better part of 4 years since then, working his way toward the name at the center of it, collecting evidence the way Eleanor had collected evidence about Ethan's death, patiently, from the outside in. "I came to Oakhaven 2 months ago," he said. "I was tracking one of Prescott's former associates, a man who was at the village and could be made to speak about what he saw." He paused. "I was close. Then McKenna's men picked me up on the road and put the cattle accusation on me, and I ended up on that platform." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "And then I bought you," she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but close. "And then you bought me," he said. She stood up and walked to the window and stood there, looking at the north pasture, where the frost was melting off the grass in the warming morning air. She thought about Ethan. She thought about Maka's village. She thought about Prescott in his manor house in the center of the valley, comfortable and powerful, and entirely accustomed to the world arranging itself around his interests, because he had never once been made to face a consequence. She thought about the ledger that Ethan had mentioned to her once, only once, in passing a record he'd been keeping of everything, dates and names and transactions, too dangerous to keep in the house. "Ethan mentioned a ledger," she said, not turning from the window. "He called it a full account. I never found it after he died. I looked, but I was also grieving, and not thinking clearly. Prescott would have searched the ranch," Maka said. "He would have and not found it, if Ethan hid things like this." She touched the map on the table, under stones, in fence posts. They looked at each other. "We should search the entire fence line," she said. "Yes," he said, "but not today. Today we—" He stopped. He had turned his head slightly toward the front of the house, toward the yard, in the way he did when something had reached him before it reached her. She heard it a second later. Horses, more than one, moving fast, coming up the main road, not slowing for the approach curve the way someone who'd been to the ranch before and knew the rut in the road would know to slow down. They came out of the house to find the yard full. Prescott was not among them. She hadn't expected Prescott himself. He was careful about distance between himself and his dirty work, but the sheriff was. McKenna, in his official coat, with a folded paper in his hand that even from the porch steps she could see bore an official seal. Behind him were a dozen riders. Some she recognized from town and some she didn't. And several of the faces she didn't recognize were the flat, hired-on faces of men who got paid specifically for this kind of work. "Eleanor Vance," McKenna said, with the formal tone of a man performing something he'd rehearsed. "By order of the territorial court, these premises are to be surrendered, pending investigation of the charge of harboring a dangerous fugitive, namely," he glanced at Maka, "the individual known to authorities as a renegade agitator wanted for the destruction of private property in Dawes County." "That charge is fabricated," Eleanor said. "Every word of it. That'll be for the court to decide." McKenna folded the paper. "The man comes with us now. You can follow along for the hearing or stay here while we conduct a search of the premises." "You're not searching my premises," she said. "You have a piece of paper from a judge who Prescott owns. That is not the same thing as lawful authority." McKenna's expression went flat. He nodded to the riders. Everything happened fast after that. She heard the sound before she understood what it was. A low, deep whump from somewhere behind the house. A rush of heat that arrived a fraction of a second after the sound. Then orange light bloomed in the south window of the kitchen, visible through the open door behind her, and she understood that while McKenna was holding her attention from the front, someone had come around the back. The homestead was on fire. She spun toward the door and arms came around her from the sides. 2 of McKenna's men, and she fought them hard and efficiently, because Ethan had taught her how, and she had not forgotten. But there were 2 of them, and she was tired and furious, and the smoke was already thick at the back of the house. From somewhere in the chaos, she heard a single shot. She twisted to look and saw Maka, already moving toward her, already between her and two of the riders who had dismounted, and then she saw the third rider, the one she hadn't tracked, bring his rifle down in a short, controlled arc, and Maka took the bullet in the chest and went down. He went down hard. He didn't cry out. He hit the dirt of the yard, and one hand came up and braced against the ground, and then his arm buckled, and he was still. Maka, her voice came out raw. She stopped fighting the men holding her, and they took advantage of it and pulled her backward toward a horse, and she was lifted onto it roughly. Her wrists caught together in front of her, and the horse moved before she had her balance. She turned to look back. The homestead was burning from the back, fire climbing the south wall, smoke pouring from the kitchen window. The barn behind it was lighting at the roofline. The entire yard was orange-lit and chaotic, horses milling, men shouting, McKenna's voice cutting through it with orders she couldn't parse. And in the center of the yard, motionless in the dirt, was Maka. Blood at his chest, firelight on his face, one hand still braced against the ground like he'd been trying to get up when the strength left him. She was pulled around the bend in the road, and the ranch disappeared behind the tree line. The last thing she saw was the fire. The last thing she felt was the absolute, unforgiving certainty that she had gotten Maka killed by the same man who had killed her husband, and that if he was dead, she was going to take this fight to its end by herself, if she had to, whatever that cost her, because some things you do not walk away from. She set her jaw and memorized the faces of every man on that road. Then she turned her face forward into the dark. Doctor Jeremiah Vance was not a man who panicked easily. He had practiced medicine in 3 territories and 2 wars, and he had learned in those years that panic was a luxury that cost too much. When things went badly, you moved. You thought while you moved, and you kept thinking until the thing in front of you was either fixed or finished, and then you let yourself feel whatever needed to be felt. So when he heard the shots and saw the fire from the ridge road above Stone Creek, he did not panic. He turned his horse toward the smoke, and he moved fast. He reached the ranch to find McKenna's men pulling out, heading back toward town with Eleanor on a horse between them, her wrists bound, and her face set in an expression he recognized from her childhood, the one she'd had when things were very bad, and she was deciding they weren't going to beat her. He counted heads, and he stayed in the tree line, and he let them pass. Then he went down to the yard. Maka was in the dirt near the house, face down, one arm bent under him. The fire was still going on the south wall, but it hadn't reached the main structure yet, and the barn was smoking, but not fully lit. Jeremiah dismounted and got down beside him and got 2 fingers to his throat. Pulse, thready but present. He rolled him carefully, checking the chest wound. The bullet had gone in below the left collarbone, angled downward. It had missed the heart, he could tell, by the simple fact of that pulse, but the lung situation was uncertain, and blood loss was a more immediate problem than anything else. He worked fast in the firelight, packing the wound with what he had in his kit, binding it tight enough to matter. Maka was unconscious and stayed that way, which was the one mercy in this situation, because a man awake for this would be fighting it. Getting him onto the horse was the hardest part. Jeremiah was 61 years old and not built for this kind of work anymore, but necessity has its own musculature, and after several attempts and considerable improvisation, he had Maka draped across the saddle and secured, and he walked the horse carefully up the north trail that cut behind the ranch into the canyon country above. The granite caves were his idea. He had known about them since he was a boy, before the town was much more than a trading post. They went back deep into the canyon wall, dry and cool and invisible from the valley below, accessible only by the upper trail that most people didn't know existed. He had used them once before, during a particularly ugly stretch of claim-jumping violence 7 years back, when he'd needed somewhere to stash a wounded man that the claimers couldn't find. He set Maka up in the main cave, built a small fire deep enough inside that the light wouldn't show from below, and sat with him through the rest of that night. In the morning, he went back for Eleanor. She was in the town lockup, technically under arrest, on the charge of obstructing the territorial court order, which McKenna had managed to stretch far enough to cover the fact that she'd argued with him in her own yard. Jeremiah went to the lockup and presented himself to the deputy on duty and explained that Eleanor Vance was his patient and was experiencing a medical situation that required immediate attention. The deputy, a young man named Court, who had not yet learned when he was being maneuvered, let him in. Eleanor took one look at him and understood immediately. "Is he alive?" she said quietly, low enough that Court couldn't hear. "Alive," Jeremiah said, and watched her exhale, "barely but alive. He needs care and time, and I need you to provide the first because I have a practice to maintain and a cover to keep." He handed her his coat, which was large enough to hide the fact that he'd removed her wrist bindings. "Can you walk out of here without Court stopping you?" She looked at Court, who was absorbed in something at his desk. "Probably," she said. "Then walk." She walked. He followed. Court didn't stop them, and later Jeremiah would tell people Eleanor had been released for medical reasons, which was close enough to a version of the truth that nobody examined it too carefully. The ride up to the canyon caves took 2 hours. Eleanor didn't talk much on the way, which was fine. She was doing what she always did when things were serious, going quiet and internal, organizing herself for what was coming. He had known her since she was born. He understood her silences. When she saw Maka, she went straight beside him and looked at the wound and at his face. And then she looked at Jeremiah. "Tell me what to do," she said. So he did. He spent 2 hours with her, going through everything: the wound packing, the fever management, the signs that would tell her if the lung had been compromised after all, the signs that would tell her things were improving. He left her his full kit and everything he could spare from his personal supplies. He would come back in 3 days. "Stay deep in the cave at night," he said before he left. "Keep the fire small. Don't go down to the valley until I tell you it's been long enough." "How long?" she said. "Until I've had time to understand what Prescott is planning next." He looked at her. "And Eleanor. The homestead is damaged, but it's standing. The south wall, mostly. I checked this morning before I came for you. It can be repaired." She looked up at him. "Thank you, Jeremiah," she said. He put his hat on and went back down the canyon. Eleanor turned to Maka and started the work of keeping him alive. It was not simple work, and it was not short. The first 2 days were the hardest. The fever came in on the second night and climbed steadily through the dark hours, and Eleanor sat beside him and worked the fever with cool water and the medicines Jeremiah had left and the particular stubborn focus she brought to everything that mattered. She slept in 2-hour stretches and woke and checked him and slept again. She talked to him sometimes, not expecting response, just filling the silence, because silence felt like giving up. She told him things she hadn't told anyone. She told him about the night she'd understood that Ethan hadn't died of fever. Not a dramatic revelation, but a slow, accumulated certainty. The kind that comes from knowing a person well enough to know what his dying of fever would have looked like. And this hadn't looked like that. She told him about the years she'd spent after that, maintaining the appearance of a grieving widow while quietly piecing together what had actually happened, careful and isolated, because she didn't know who she could trust, and incorrect trust would get her killed. She told him about the loneliness of that year. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. She knew before she opened her eyes that morning. The cave had a quality to it that was different. The sound of his breathing had changed, settled into something that had a rhythm to it that the last 2 days hadn't. She sat up and put her hand to his forehead, and the skin was damp but cool. She sat back and pressed her palms over her eyes and breathed. He was still asleep and stayed way through the morning, a real sleep now, not the restless, burning unconsciousness of the fever. She ate something for the first time in 2 days, a biscuit from Jeremiah's supplies, and drank water and stood at the cave mouth and looked out at the canyon. It was beautiful up here. She hadn't had the presence of mind to notice that before, but she noticed it now. The canyon walls were deep red granite, old and layered, with stands of pine growing from the cracks where enough soil had accumulated. Below, in the narrow canyon floor, a thin creek ran clear. The sky above was that particular blue that belongs to high altitude in November, hard and brilliant, the kind that makes everything below it look extremely defined. She heard Maka move. She went back inside. He was awake, or most of the way there, his eyes open, tracking, taking in the cave and the firelight, and then finding her. "You're in a canyon cave," she said. "About 2 miles above the ranch. Jeremiah brought you here. You've been feverish for 2 days." He processed this without visible surprise. "The bullet," he said. "Jeremiah says it missed everything. Essential. You're going to be in considerable discomfort for a while, but you're going to be whole." She sat beside him. "Don't try to sit up yet." He relaxed back. He looked at the cave ceiling. "The ranch," he said. "Damaged, not destroyed. Jeremiah says the repaired." She paused. "They took me and left you in the yard. I thought you were dead." He was quiet for a moment. "I heard you call my name," he said. She hadn't known that. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and between them in the low light of the cave, there was something that had been building for weeks now, across shared work and shared silence and shared danger, and it had nowhere left to go except where it was. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was not impulsive, and it was not tentative. It was deliberate, the way she did everything that mattered to her, fully, without hedging. He kissed her back with a gravity that matched it, his hand coming up to her face, careful of his shoulder, careful and sure. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. The fire crackled. Outside, the canyon wind moved through the pines with that low, steady sound that could convince you, if you let it, that the world was entirely quiet and entirely safe. "We're going to finish this," she said. "Yes," he said. "Ethan's ledger, the map, the badge. We have enough to take to a federal judge if we can find one that Prescott hasn't touched." "Jeremiah," Maka said. "He will know who can be trusted." "I'll ask him when he comes back." She sat back slightly, still close. "But first you're going to let that chest heal for at least another week, and you're not going to argue with me about it." He looked at her with an expression that was as close to arguing as he got, which was to say, a certain quality of stillness that implied disagreement without committing to it. "A week," she said firmly. He didn't argue. The days in the canyon changed things. They talked differently up here than they had at the ranch. At the ranch, there had always been the next fence post, the next problem pulling at the edge of attention. Up here, stripped back to the absolute essentials, there was only conversation and fire and the slow work of healing. He told her more about his life before Oakhaven, about the years of scouting which he had come to with ambivalence and left with grief, understanding too late at the full dimensions of what the Army's movement through the territories actually meant. He had believed, early on, that his knowledge of the land made him valuable in a way that would earn genuine respect. He had been partly right and entirely wrong. She told him about Ethan, the full picture, not the shorthand version she gave people who asked politely, about who Ethan had been as a person, his stubbornness and his humor, and the way he'd been constitutionally incapable of letting an injustice pass without doing something about it, which was both the best thing about him and, in the end, the thing that killed him. "He would have liked you," she said once. Maka considered this. Would he? He was drawn to people who were honest, she said. People who did what they said and didn't perform at the world. He didn't have much patience for performance. She looked at her hands. "You're the least performative person I've ever met." Maka was quiet for a moment. "Your husband was a man of principle," he said. "He died for it. That is not a small thing." "No," she said, "it isn't." On the 7th night, they sat at the mouth of the cave and watched the stars come out over the canyon. The air was cold enough that their breath showed. Eleanor had a blanket around her shoulders. Maka sat upright on his own now, still careful, still deliberate about how he used his left side, but upright. The stars were extraordinary from here. No town light, no fire smoke, just the full dark sky doing what it did when nothing interrupted it. "My grandmother told me," Maka said, after a while, "that the stars were the fires of those who came before us. She said you could tell how many good people had lived by counting the lights." He looked up. "I did not believe it when I was young. I did not have much use for comfort then. Do you now?" Eleanor asked. He was quiet, looking at the sky. "I think comfort is not the point of it." he said at last. The point is that something persists. After the fire and the ash, something remains and gives light. He looked at her. Your husband's work persists. In the map he hid. In the ledger we haven't found yet. In you. He paused. What Prescott burned did not stay burned. Eleanor looked at the stars and thought about that for a long time. No, she said finally, it didn't. Below them the canyon creek ran in the dark, and somewhere in the valley Prescott sat in his manor house, believing he had won, and above it all the stars burned on in their thousands, indifferent and permanent and bright. Jeremiah came back on the 8th day. He came up the canyon trail in the late afternoon, his old horse picking its way carefully between the rocks, and arrived at the cave mouth looking windburned and carrying a pack that turned out to contain, among other things, a cold roasted chicken, 2 apples, a jar of coffee, and Ethan's ledger. Eleanor stared at the ledger. It was a brown cloth-bound book, the cover water-stained at the corner, the spine reinforced with electrical tape in a way that said Ethan had repaired it at some point and intended to keep it in use for a long time. She had never seen it before. She hadn't known what she was looking for. Where, she said. Under the floorboard in my storage room, Jeremiah said, setting the pack down and lowering himself onto a flat rock, with the careful movement of a man whose knees had opinions. Ethan asked me to hold it about 3 months before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I'd know what to do with it. He looked at her. I have been trying to determine the right moment for 4 years, and I believe this is it. She sat down with the ledger in her hands and opened it. It was meticulous. Dates, names, amounts, transactions. Water diversion records going back 5 years, with precise notations about where the natural flow had been and what had been done to redirect it. Letters copies in Ethan's careful hand of correspondence between Prescott and territorial officials whose names she recognized from county government. Witness accounts, signed, from 3 ranchers who had been pressured off their land and were willing to say so in writing. And at the back, folded into the final pages, 2 letters from the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne acknowledging receipt of Ethan's initial report and requesting additional documentation. Ethan had been in active contact with federal marshals. He had been weeks, maybe days, from having enough to move on. She closed the book carefully. She looked at Maka, who had been reading over her shoulder for the last several minutes. This is enough, she said. For a federal court, he said. Yes, Prescott will know we have it once we move. He has people in town he'll know within hours of us going to any authority that doesn't report to McKenna. Then we get the ledger and the map and the badge to someone outside his reach before he knows we're out of this canyon, Maka said. Jeremiah nodded. There's a circuit judge, Marcus Holt. He comes through the valley every 2 months and holds court in whatever venue is available. His next appearance is 11 days from now. He is not a man who accommodates Harrison Prescott. I know this because Prescott once tried to have him reassigned, and it didn't work. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. I've already sent a letter to his advance writer, explaining the situation in enough detail to get us an audience. I expect a response within 3 days. Eleanor looked at him. You've been planning this, she said. I've been practicing medicine in this valley for 30 years, Jeremiah said. I have watched Harrison Prescott ruin more good people than I can easily count, and I am 61 years old, which means if I'm going to do something useful about it, I should probably do it soon. He took the chicken out of the pack and set it between them. Eat something. You both look terrible. They ate. The plan took shape over the next 2 days. Jeremiah came and went, carrying information. The circuit judge had responded. He would hear testimony privately and in advance of his official session, which allowed for protective measures that an open courtroom couldn't provide. Prescott's manor house was the problem. He kept his official records there, the land transfer documents, the correspondence with corrupt territorial officials, everything that would form the government's counterclaim against the ledger. And while the ledger was extraordinary, the ledger, plus those records, would be definitive. They needed to get into Prescott's house. Maka was the one who said it plainly. We go in at night, he said, during the storm. He had been watching the weather building on the western ridge for 2 days, a serious weather system pushing in from the mountains. the kind that brought 2 or 3 days of hard rain and kept everyone inside. He has 8 men in the house and 4 outside. In heavy rain, the outside men will be under cover. The west wall of the manor has a loading bay goods entrance. No windows above it, on the second story. We go in there. And if we're caught, Eleanor said, we won't be. She looked at him. Maka, she said. We won't be, he said again, not with arrogance, but with the particular certainty of a man who had operated at night in difficult terrain in conditions far worse than a cattle baron's house. I have gone into more dangerous places than this. She believed him. That wasn't entirely the same thing as being comfortable with the plan, but she believed him. They left the canyon on the night of the storm. The rain came in hard off the mountains, not the theatrical kind that announces itself, but the steady, insistent kind that simply arrives and continues, soaking everything evenly and reducing visibility to the distance of an outstretched arm. They came down the trail in full dark, moving slowly, Maka still managing his left side with care but managing it, and they made the valley floor by midnight. Prescott's manor was set back from the main road behind a wrought iron fence and a long carriage drive lined with cottonwoods. It was the largest structure in the valley, 2 stories of stone and timber, with lit windows on the ground floor. Even at this hour, she could see a figure behind one window, lamplit, moving back and forth. Prescott kept late hours. She had heard that about him. They went around to the west wall. The loading bay was exactly where Maka had described, a wide wooden overhang above a reinforced door, the kind used for receiving large deliveries. The door was padlocked, but the padlock was old, and Maka dealt with it in less time than she would have thought possible, working by touch in the dark. Inside, storage, mostly crates and barrels, and the accumulated goods of a man who bought in bulk. A narrow stair at the back going up to the main house level. They went up. The ground floor of the manor was dark, except for the lamplight under one door, at the end of the hall, Prescott's study. They could hear him in there, the scrape of a chair, the rustle of paper. He was working. The study they needed was the records room, which Jeremiah had described from a house call he'd made there 6 years ago. Second door, on the left, off the main hall. They found it. The door was not locked. Inside, a filing cabinet and 2 heavy shelves of bound record books, organized by year. She found the land transfer documents in 12 minutes. Maka found the correspondence with the Territorial Secretary's office in 8. Together, they constituted exactly what they needed. Prescott's own documentation of transactions he'd represented differently to different parties. The kind of self-incriminating paper trail that a man builds when he's been operating without consequences for long enough to get comfortable. They were 3 minutes from the door. When the light changed in the hall, the study door at the end of the corridor had opened. Prescott stepped out. He was a large man, well-fed, gray at the temples, with the bearing of someone who had owned the majority of the available space in every room he'd ever entered. He carried a lamp. In the light of it, his face was ruddy and tired-looking, and for a moment, he stood in the hallway, apparently looking for something, a decanter from the sideboard, she realized. He'd come out for a drink, and then he turned toward the records room and stopped. He saw them. What happened in the next few seconds held in the air like something crystallized. Prescott's expression moved through surprise, recognition, and into something cold and calculating, without passing through fear at any point. She would remember that later. He was not afraid of them. He was assessing. Maka had his pistol out and leveled. "Put the lamp down," Maka said. Prescott put the lamp down on the sideboard. He looked at the papers under Eleanor's arm. He looked at Maka's gun. His jaw shifted. "You won't shoot me," he said. "You don't have it in you. You're a scout, not a killer, you." "You ordered the destruction of my village," Maka said. The cold quiet of those words stopped Prescott's speech entirely. "You ordered the deaths of people who had done nothing to you except exist on land you wanted. You murdered Eleanor's husband because he was going to expose what you'd stolen. You have burned and threatened and paid for violence against people who had no way to fight back." Maka took a step toward him. The gun stayed level. I have been looking for you for 4 years. Prescott's composure cracked slightly. Slightly. You pull that trigger, he said. And my men, your men are asleep or under cover in the rain, Maka said, and I am here. Eleanor watched Maka's face. She had seen him controlled and deliberate, and capable of a coldness that belonged to survival, not cruelty. She saw all of that now, focused down to a point. 4 years of loss and rage held in the hand that held the pistol. And she saw him make the decision. She stepped forward and put her hand on his arm, not to push it down. Just there, present. If you kill him in the dark, she said quietly, they will call you the savage he lied about. Maka's eyes stayed on Prescott. He must face a federal judge, she said. That is the difference between cold revenge and true justice. A long silence. Rain on the roof, steady and complete. She felt the tension in Maka's arm under her hand. The held thing. The years of it. She didn't look away from his face. He lowered the gun. Not quickly, not all at once, but deliberately, in full control, with the full understanding of what he was choosing and what he was giving up by choosing it. Prescott exhaled. Maka looked at him with an expression that was harder to withstand than the gun had been. There is a federal circuit judge, 11 days from now, Eleanor said to Prescott. You will explain yourself to him. Everything in these papers and everything in Ethan's ledger will be presented. You will not buy your way out of this one. She held his gaze. If you run, or if you attempt to destroy evidence, or if any harm comes to anyone connected to this case, the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne has already been notified of your name and activities. That process does not stop with you. Prescott looked at the papers under her arm. He looked at Maka. He looked at Eleanor. He said nothing. But something behind his eyes shifted, and she recognized it because she had seen it in a handful of people over the course of her life, the look of a man who has finally understood that the ground beneath him is no longer solid. Step back from the sideboard, Maka said. Prescott stepped back. They left the way they'd come, out through the loading bay, into the hard rain, with Prescott's documents under Eleanor's coat, and Ethan's 4 years of waiting, finally having somewhere to go. They rode away from the manor into the dark and the rain, and neither of them spoke for several minutes. Then Eleanor said, without looking over, "Thank you." Maka rode beside her in the rain and thought about what he had held in that hallway and what he had set down. Your husband, he said finally. He chose law over force, knowing it might not protect him. Yes, she said. He was braver than I am, Maka said. She looked at him then in the rain and the dark and shook her head. What you put down in that hallway was harder than pulling the trigger, she said. Don't tell me that wasn't brave. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the road. Above them, the storm moved across the valley in great slow sheets, and somewhere behind them, Prescott's lit windows receded into the dark, and the ledger was dry under Eleanor's coat. And 11 days from now, Harrison Prescott was going to face a federal judge. That was enough. For tonight, it was enough. They had 3 days before the circuit judge arrived. 3 days to stay alive, stay free, and keep the documents intact. Jeremiah had the ledger and the records from Prescott's house secured in a place he hadn't told either of them about, which was wise. You couldn't be pressured to reveal what you genuinely didn't know. Eleanor and Maka stayed off the main roads, moving between the upper canyon and a line shack on the northeast edge of Stone Creek land that Prescott's men likely didn't know existed. It was on the second day that Clyde Miller found them. She didn't know how. Later, she would piece together that someone in town had spotted them buying supplies at the far edge of Ridgeback Creek Settlement, 6 miles east, and word had traveled faster than it should have. That was the thing about Prescott's network. It didn't announce itself. It simply produced results. They were moving south through the narrow rock passage that locals called Devil's Canyon when Eleanor heard the horses. Not ahead, behind. She looked at Maka. He had already heard it and was reading the canyon walls on both sides with the focused attention of someone doing rapid calculation. Devil's Canyon was aptly named. The passage ran for about a mile between sheer granite walls that pressed in close enough in places that 2 riders couldn't move abreast. The floor was loose, shale over sandstone, unreliable underfoot, cut through in 3 places by patches of what looked like firm ground, but wasn't. She knew this canyon. She had pulled a calf out of one of those patches 7 years ago and spent 2 hours doing it. Maka knew it too. She could see him knowing it. How many? She asked. 6, maybe 8. He turned his horse. We go forward, not back. They'll cut us off at the south end. Yes, he said. Let them. She didn't understand that yet, but she trusted it. And they moved. The riders behind them pushed hard, not trying to be quiet about it now, and the sound of shod hooves on shale filled the canyon in a way that bounced off the walls and made it seem like the horses were everywhere at once. Eleanor kept close to the left wall, following Maka, watching the ground. Clyde Miller's voice came from behind them. End of the road, scout! You and the widow pull up, and this goes easy. Maka Din's horse, right, toward the center of the canyon floor, and stopped. He turned around. Eleanor pulled up beside him and looked back at the approaching riders. Miller was at the front. She recognized him from descriptions. A lean man in a black coat with a stillness about him that was the professional kind, the kind that belonged to someone who had learned a long time ago that the most frightening thing you can do is move slowly when everyone else is panicking. Behind Miller, his men spread out as much as the canyon allowed. Miller looked at Maka. He looked at where Maka had stopped. He looked at the ground, but he didn't look at it long enough. He urged his horse forward, and his men followed, and the ground under the leading horses changed character without announcing it, and Miller's horse went through the surface to its fetlocks in wet silica sand that gripped and held, and then to its knees, and Miller had perhaps 2 seconds to understand what had happened before the horse was in serious trouble, and he was going with it. The patch was large. 3 of his men hit it before the ones behind could stop. The canyon filled with shouting and the desperate thrashing of horses trying to find purchase they couldn't find, and the men in the back pulled up hard, horses rearing against the bits, trying to reverse on the narrow shale. Miller was in it to his horse's barrel. He was off the animal and into the sand himself in the next moment, trying to lighten the horse's load, and the sand took him to his knees immediately. Miller, Eleanor called out. He looked up at her. His face was a complicated thing. Fury, pride, the dawning understanding of what was happening to him and how quickly it was going to get worse. Maka dismounted. He moved to the edge of the patch and assessed it a quick, practiced read of the surface, the margins, where the firm ground was. He pulled the rope from his saddle. He was in the sand to his ankles before he stopped, using a flat rock as a platform, and he threw the rope to Miller. Miller caught it. He looked at it. He looked at Maka. For a moment, he didn't pull. Take it, Maka said. Miller pulled. Maka braced against the flat rock and hauled, and it was ugly work, slow and grinding, the sand reluctant to release what it had taken. Eleanor came down and added her weight to the rope, and after several long minutes, Miller came free, with a sound like a cork pulled from a bottle and collapsed on firm shale, gasping. His horse came out after, trembling and exhausted, and stood with its head down. Miller sat on the ground and looked at Maka, who was coiling the rope with the calm efficiency of someone who had already moved on to the next thing in his mind. Sand to the waist, soaked through, out of breath from the effort, and already thinking about the horse. Why? Miller said. Maka looked at him. My ancestors' land does not drink the blood of men trapped by the earth, he said. The canyon was quiet, except for the horses blowing, and the distant sound of Miller's remaining men on the far side of the patch, unable to cross, watching in uncertain silence. Miller sat on the shale and looked at the man who had just pulled him out of the ground, and Eleanor watched something move through the enforcer's face that she suspected had not moved through it in a very long time. It was not a comfortable thing for him. You could see that, but it was real. She looked at the men across the patch. Go back to town, she said. It's over. They went. The circuit judge held his session in the Long Rail Saloon. It was the largest interior space in Oakhaven, which wasn't saying much. The tables had been pushed back, and a bench had been set up at the far end where the bar ran, and Judge Marcus Holt sat behind it with his black coat and his complete lack of interest in being impressed by anyone in the room. He was a compact, gray-haired man with the hearing of someone 20 years younger, and the patience of someone who had made up his mind long ago to simply let the facts do the work. The saloon was full, standing room only, the word having spread the way it always did in small places rapidly, and without anyone quite knowing how. Prescott was there with two attorneys and the sheriff beside him, all of them arranged at a table to the judge's right with the composed confidence of men who had navigated legal situations before and come out ahead. Prescott looked at Eleanor when she came in, and his eyes went briefly to Maka behind her, and then he looked away. Eleanor and Maka sat to the judge's left, with Jeremiah beside them, and a young federal recorder at the end of the row who had come in with the judge's party, and whose job was to put everything said into the official record. The proceedings started. Prescott's attorneys moved immediately, and they moved hard. The first motion was for Maka's removal from the proceedings on the grounds of the outstanding fugitive warrant. The second was for Eleanor's testimony to be disqualified on the grounds of personal interest. The third was a broad claim that the documents obtained from Prescott's manor had been acquired unlawfully and were therefore inadmissible. Judge Holt listened to all three motions without expression. Then he denied all three in approximately 90 seconds, citing specific territorial statute for each denial, speaking without notes. Prescott's senior attorney started to respond. "Counselor," the judge said, without raising his voice, "I've been on this circuit for 14 years. I know which way the wind blows in every valley between here and the territorial line, and I know who has been making it blow." "You will sit down." The attorney sat down. Eleanor presented the ledger. She walked the judge through it, page by page, calmly and precisely, the way Ethan had taught her to think about evidence chronologically, with context, without embellishment. The judge asked questions. She answered them. The recorder's pen moved steadily. The Prescott documents came next, the land transfer records, the correspondence with territorial officials. The judge examined each one with the careful attention of a man who reads for a living and knows what he's reading. Then the silver badge. She set it on the bench and explained where it had come from and what the mark on the back indicated. McKenna, sitting beside Prescott, had gone the color of old ash. Prescott's attorneys made objections. The judge noted them for the record and continued. Then something happened that nobody in the room had anticipated. Clyde Miller stood up. He was in the back of the room, near the door, still carrying the gait of a man whose legs remembered the quicksand from 2 days ago. Every head in the saloon turned. Prescott turned. For one moment, the room was entirely still. "I'd like to speak," Miller said to the judge. Judge Holt looked at him over the top of his papers. "Come forward, then," the judge said. Miller came forward. He stood at the front of the room, and he looked at the recorder, and then he looked at the judge, and he said what he had come to say in the flat, factual tone of a man who had decided to tell the truth and was going to do it without decoration. He had been employed by Harrison Prescott for 6 years. He named the operations he had run at Prescott's direction the water diversion enforcement, the pressure campaigns against small ranchers, the raid on Stone Creek Ranch. He named specific orders and who had given them. He confirmed McKenna's involvement. He stated clearly that Ethan Vance had been killed on Prescott's instruction, not from fever, and named the men who had done it and where they could be found. The room was absolutely quiet while he spoke. When he was done, Judge Holt looked at him for a moment. "You understand that this testimony places you in significant legal jeopardy," the judge said. "Yes, sir," Miller said. "I do." The judge nodded and made a note. Prescott's attorneys were both on their feet, both talking at once, and the judge let them go for about 15 seconds before he raised one hand, and they stopped. "Mr. Prescott," the judge said. Prescott straightened in his chair. "The evidence presented today is comprehensive and corroborated. It documents fraud, land theft, conspiracy, illegal diversion of water resources, coercion of public officials, and the murder of Ethan Vance." The judge set his papers down. "This court finds the charges against Maka to be fabricated and without legal foundation. He is exonerated fully, and the warrant is dissolved." He looked at the recorder. "Note that for the federal record." Then he looked at McKenna. "Sheriff, you are relieved of your position effective immediately, and you will surrender your sidearm to the federal officer present. His gaze moved to Prescott. Harrison Prescott, you are remanded to federal custody pending trial on the charges I have enumerated. The attorneys from Cheyenne will be here within the week. Prescott stood up. Sit down, Mr. Prescott, the judge said quietly. Prescott sat down. Eleanor stood. She had not planned to speak. Not formally, but she was standing before she had consciously decided to, and the room was looking at her, and she had things that needed to be said out loud in this room, in front of these people, while there was still time for them to mean something. This man was brought into this town in irons, she said. He was put on a platform in your square, in the full heat of summer, and you called him a savage beast, and you were going to sell him into the mines. You did that because of what he looked like and where he came from, and because Prescott told you he was dangerous, and none of you stopped to ask whether any of it was true. She looked around the room. She didn't say it with anger. Anger would have let people dismiss it. You called him a savage because he spoke a different language and wore different clothes. But when a child was trapped, when the land was poisoned, and when his worst enemy was sinking into the earth, he was the only one who acted with mercy. She let that sit for a moment. Federal law and human dignity do not belong to one race. They belong to every human soul willing to stand for what is right. The saloon was very quiet. She sat down. Maka, beside her, looked straight ahead, but his hand found hers under the table, and he held it, and she held it back. Outside, federal officers moved through the room toward Prescott, and the long rail saloon became a place where something that had been a long time coming finally arrived. The homestead went up in 4 days. That was the part that surprised Eleanor most, not that people came, but how many, and how fast, and how they came without being asked. The Hadley family with their wagon and tools. The Riordan brothers who ran the mill and brought timber already cut to length. Mrs. Calvert from the dry goods store with food for 20 people, 3 days running. Families she barely knew. From the far edges of the valley, who had watched Prescott squeeze this county for years and had been waiting without knowing it for a reason to come out from under it. They raised the new south wall on the first day, the barn frame on the second. By the 4th day, Stone Creek Ranch had a kitchen that was larger than the original, with a proper stone hearth that Maka built himself from the granite he hauled down from the canyon. Maka worked beside them all, not apart, not tolerated alongside. The Hadley boys deferred to his judgment on the frame construction. Old Riordan asked him twice about joinery technique and listened carefully to the answers. Hetty followed him around the site, narrating events that didn't require narration, and he bore this with the same patient silence he brought to everything. Eleanor watched this from the corner of her eye while she worked, not making much of it, but watching. On the evening of the 4th day, when most of the others had gone home, she sat on the new porch steps with a cup of coffee and looked at the creek. It was running clear, had been running clear since they'd cleared the blockage. Some of the downstream families had already reported better pasture, healthier cattle. The land recovered fast when you let it. Prescott was in federal custody in Cheyenne. McKenna had resigned rather than face the alternative and left the county entirely. Miller was cooperating with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentencing, and doing so with the deliberate thoroughness of a man who had decided that if he was going to do something, he was going to do it properly. The 3 men who had killed Ethan were being located. It would take time. Legal things took time. But the machinery was in motion, and it had been set in motion by honest evidence and honest testimony, not by a gun in a dark hallway, and that distinction mattered in ways that would outlast all of them. Jeremiah came by that evening and sat with them on the porch for a while, drinking coffee and talking about nothing important, and when he left, he patted Eleanor's shoulder and shook Maka's hand and said, "Good work," with the plain sincerity of someone who didn't say things he didn't mean. Then it was just the 2 of them. The sun was going down over the western ridge, doing what sunsets do in that high country in November, turning the sky colors that seemed like an exaggeration until you were looking directly at them, orange deepening into red, the canyon walls going dark from the bottom up, the creek catching the last of the light on its surface. Maka reached into the front pocket of his jacket. He had been working on something for the past 2 weeks. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, sitting by the fire with a piece of white quartz he'd found in the upper canyon and a small carving blade. She had seen him at it and hadn't asked. He'd asked for no audience, and she'd given him none. He held it out to her now. It was a pendant, small, carved from the white quartz into a shape that was both a stone and something more than a stone, a form that suggested wings, or water moving, or arms around something. She couldn't entirely name the shape and understood that was intentional. Some things are better carried than defined. A thin strip of leather ran through a hole bored through the top. "May I?" he said. She turned, and he placed it around her neck and tied the leather cord with careful, sure hands. "It is a protection symbol," he said. "In my tradition, it is given when you want someone to carry your care for them, wherever they go." He paused. "It is also given between people who have decided to go the same direction." She reached up and touched the pendant. She turned back to face him, and they stood close in the cooling evening air, with the last light of the sun on the canyon walls behind them. And he looked at her with the same steady, unperformative directness he brought to everything that mattered to him. She kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the creek ran behind them in the near dark. They married 10 days later. Jeremiah performed the ceremony in the yard of Stone Creek Ranch on a morning that had turned unexpectedly warm, the kind of November day that feels like a gift rather than an accident. Hetty had insisted on braiding flowers into her hair and had been permitted to do so. Several families from the valley attended, standing in the yard with the naturalness of people who had come to celebrate rather than to observe. Maka had prepared something. Lakota ceremonial words, spoken quietly, intended for her rather than the audience. Eleanor didn't know the language, but she knew what she was hearing. She held his hands and listened to every word. Then Jeremiah said the Western words, which were shorter, and the whole thing was complete. Afterward, while people ate and talked in the yard, and Hetty organized a highly structured game that nobody entirely understood the rules of, Eleanor and Maka walked up to the ridge above the ranch. Just the two of them. It was a walk they had made before, separately and together, and the ground was familiar under their boots. From the top of the ridge you could see the full length of the valley, the creek winding south through the past pasturelands, clear from here. The rebuilt homestead below, smoke from the new kitchen, hearth rising straight in the still air. The canyon country to the north, ancient and red-walled and unhurried. And in every direction, the land doing what land does, when the things blocking it are finally removed, just running, just growing, just being what it had always been underneath. Maka stood beside her looking out at it. "My grandmother said that the land remembers," he said. "What is taken from it and what is given back," she said. "It waits, but it does not forget." Eleanor looked at the valley. "Then I think this valley has had a good day," she said. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, since the platform and the shackles and the knife at her throat and everything that had come after, he smiled, fully, without reservation. She smiled back. Below them, Stone Creek Ranch sat in the afternoon light, rebuilt and standing, the creek running clear past the new stone hearth and the repaired fence line and the hay barn that would be full again by spring. The valley had learned something at considerable cost. Whether it would hold the lesson was a question only time could answer. But today it held it, and the creek ran on. And that's where Eleanor and Maka's story ends, not with a perfect world, but with a valley that finally learned to breathe again. The creek runs clear, the homestead stands, and two people who had every reason to give up on humanity chose, again and again, to believe in it anyway. But before we close the book on Stone Creek Ranch, I want to sit with you for just a moment because this story wasn't only about romance, and it wasn't only about the West. It was about something that cuts a lot deeper than either of those things. Think about what Eleanor did in that town square. She didn't know Maka. She didn't owe him anything. She was broke, stretched thin, and surrounded by a crowd that wasn't on her side. But she saw a man being stripped of his dignity in broad daylight, and she made a decision. not a comfortable decision, not a safe one. $70 and every ounce of her credibility placed on the line for a stranger. She did it because she understood something that the crowd had forgotten, that a person's humanity doesn't require your approval to be real. It simply is. And when you look away from that, you lose something in yourself that's very hard to get back. Now think about Maka. Here was a man who had been betrayed by institutions, abandoned by the systems that were supposed to protect him, and had watched everything he loved destroyed by someone who faced zero consequences for it. He had 4 years of grief and rage, and absolute justification to pull that trigger in Prescott's hallway. 4 years, and he put the gun down anyway, not because he was weak, not because he had forgiven what was done to him, but because Eleanor said something true, that justice and revenge are not the same thing, and the difference between them matters enormously. Revenge ends with you. Justice outlasts you. Maka chose the thing that would outlast him, and that is one of the hardest choices a human being can make. This story also asks us to look honestly at how we decide who deserves our respect. The people of Oakhaven called Maka a savage. They used that word with confidence and without shame because they had decided, based on nothing more than his appearance and his origins, that he existed in a different category of person than they did. And then they watched him pull his worst enemy out of quicksand. They watched him stand in a courtroom and choose law over vengeance. They watched him build a hearth for a community that had humiliated him and left him in irons. And they had to sit with the question that Hetty, a 7-year-old girl, answered without hesitation: which one of these people is actually worth more? Character is what you do when the cost is real. It was always that simple. They had just been taught to look at the wrong things. There's something else in this story that I think about a lot, and it's the way Eleanor and Maka found each other. Not through ease, not through circumstances that were kind to either of them. They found each other through shared work and shared danger, and the slow, unglamorous process of learning to trust someone who had every reason not to trust you back. Real connection, the kind that holds when things get hard, is almost never built in the moments that are comfortable. It's built in the creek bed when you're knee-deep in mud and someone reaches out a hand. It's built in a cave at 2 in the morning when you're keeping a fever down by sheer stubbornness and refusing to let go. It's built in the small, consistent choices to show up honestly, day after day, even when it costs you something. So if this story gave you anything, I hope it's this. Dignity is not something that has to be earned by meeting someone else's standard. Justice is worth more than revenge, even when revenge is justified. Trust is built slowly and through honesty, not through grand gestures. And the land, the work, the relationships, the things you build with care, remembers what you put into it. Eleanor knew that. Maka knew that. And now I think so do you. Thank you for spending this time at Stone Creek Ranch. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs it today. And if you're new here, there are more stories waiting. Good ones, the kind that stay with you. We'll see you at the next chapter. This story is a work of historical fiction created for entertainment and storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and locations are fictional and do not represent any specific real individuals, communities, or historical events.